Welcome to Author's Alcove. I am your host, Agnes Wolf. Today, I have the privilege of having a developmental editor with Inventing Reality Editing, Rob Bignell. I have not only interviewed him once, twice, but actually 3 times. This will be our 3rd time interviewing. And today's topic is going to be show, not tell. He is the writer of the Storytelling 101 Quick Read series, which I personally use as resources for myself. Currently, I am reading the Write Your Stories First Pages. I think I said that the last time I was talking to him, but now I'm going back and reading that one yet again. So they truly are just really quick reads. Love them, strongly recommend them. They are free if you have Kindle Unlimited, which is amazing. So today we'll be talking, as I already said, show not tell, and other tips that he gives in his Mastering Show Not Tell book. So welcome, Rob. How are you today?
Hey, doing great. Thanks. Great introduction, by the way.
So I know I've had you on here for a while, so I'm not going to ask you to share about yourself, but I would love to hear what you've been up to since the last time we talked.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, I'm all over the place. So doing too many things, right? Aren't we all though? So my primary job I do is editing. So I'm editing a few different books right now, and they range from spirituality, where this woman is talking about. It's a really difficult book to actually edit because it's so emotional, and she's talking about the loss of her daughter. Daughter's like 10 years old, and lost her to cancer, and sort of the spiritual growth that she experienced in the days following that. So, and then I go to really straight, just the facts, ma'am, kind of a thing about the history of the United States of America. So, it was written by a history professor, and they're both on opposite coasts. And then, of course, in between that, I've got a couple of different novels and so on that I've been editing. For my own writing, I'm primarily working on my Storytelling 101 series, and that I find my clients find it really helpful. And then I'm converting all of those into courses that eventually will be online for people to take. So you can choose buy the course or buy the book, or you can go through 4,000 blog entries and see if you can find those on your own for free. And the next one that I'm working on right now is actually the writing process. So writing process for fiction will be coming out next week, actually. The first week of April, let's say, based on when the podcast comes out. And then the one that's coming out in May will be the writing process for nonfiction. Originally, I was going to do them both together, but found that I had to give examples for both fiction and nonfiction, and the book was no longer a quick read. It was something that would take 3-4 hours to read instead of just a single hour to 90 minutes. So I split them up. And then let's see, what else am I doing in addition to that? Well, then I write hiking guidebooks on the side. And so I pretty much do my hiking from May through September, maybe late April and early October, based on how good the season is and if it's dry and the weather's warm. So I'm just wrapping up the tail end of the writing portion of my hiking guide book year, and I'm currently working on Petrified Forest National Park. So I just had Saguaro National Park came out last month for the upcoming spring season, and I'll get Petrified out yet this spring, and then I got to go hiking a bunch of national parks and come back and start writing again in October. So you can say I'm all over the place and doing lots of different things, keeping busy.
If we hadn't had our grandson born this year, we were actually planning on traveling. And that was one thing my husband wanted to do, was travel to these different national parks and go hiking. Yes. So we'll have to check out your books. I'll have to tell him so he can study for when. We figured we'll wait till the baby's at least a year old, then maybe we'll travel just a little bit before. But we don't want to be gone too long.
Right. Well, you can get a child carrier. And as long as the child's old enough to hold up its head, which is usually 4 to 6 months, depending on its development, you can start taking it hiking. And I took my son on my first hike in a child carrier. He was only 4.5 months old. And we went through the redwoods, and he was just having a great time. He couldn't imagine those trees, how big they were. And just looking at them, even at 4.5 months, he was awed. So Anyways, I'm sorry, but we're
Awesome.
not here to talk about hiking guidebooks. So save that for another time.
Yes. So what one thing that I find interesting on
Yeah.
Facebook is that a lot of people seem to be confused at what show not tell is.
Yes, yes.
And so can you just kind of briefly describe what show not tell is for those who might be kind of confused about it?
Right, sure. Yeah, and I find this a lot with a lot of clients who are new authors, new aspiring authors, and maybe some of them haven't been writing, they're just trying to do it in retirement and have started writing and then they can't figure out why their story isn't interesting. And the idea for the story is great. And they've kind of outlined it and plotted it all out, and their plot and character arc looks wonderful, but there's something about the craftsmanship of their storytelling that doesn't work. And usually the first thing you look at is show not tell. You might look at other things too, like passive versus active verbs, but show not tell is the big killer. Show not tell is, if you're telling, what you're doing is just stating the facts. It's like reading an encyclopedia article or listening to a newscast or reading a newspaper or reading an article in a magazine about how to do something, whether it be putting on makeup to, how to go out and hunt. There's a whole variety of nonfiction that's out there, and it's all exposition. And exposition is perfect for nonfiction because when you're reading something like a how-to book, you want straight facts, step-by-step approach, right? But storytelling or fiction is a lot different than that. Fiction is trying to get you sort of immersed into this universe of your mind and your imagination, and you're connecting with the author's vision in their head about what that universe is like and what's happening in it. So you want to feel like you're in that universe. So rather than tell people, this is what happened to character A at point B in the story, and this is what happened to character B at point C in the story, instead you want to show them. And the way you show it is by inferring what is occurring or what is happening. So if you don't mind, I actually grabbed a copy of my book here, of my notes, because I find it's better to give examples than it is to explain it sometimes. So here's an example of exposition or telling. Lambert was excited to see another boot print. And you can see how that's just stating a fact. He's excited, right? But instead, in storytelling, you want to infer his excitement. So you instead could write something like this. There's another one, Lambert said, pointing at the boot print. So now, by his excitement of saying, oh, there's another one, and pointing, that infers that he's excited. And so that's the kind of storytelling you want to do, where you infer emotional states, among many other things, and kind of help us immerse us into that story. Because now in that second example where you're showing, it feels like you're right with Lambert there, and he's pointing and you're looking at it, and yeah, that is a boot print. But if you just say, yeah, he was excited to see a boot print, you're like, well, you could be in another room, who knows, right?
So what would you say, you pointed out a few of them, but what would you say is the most common show not tell mistake that especially new authors tend to make?
Sure. They tend to tell the backstory, which is all exposition. So they create this wonderful universe, and they create all of this, especially in fantasy and science fiction, for example. They create a universe, and they do a lot of world building and spend a lot of time on it. And that's really great. Or in historical fiction, an author does tons of research and wants to give you a lay of, this is what the world is like, this is who's in power, and what kind of cities there are, and how people are dressing, and so on. Or you might have in a romance where an aspiring author starts off by telling us about the main character and going through all of the trials and tribulations of her divorce or her last breakup with the last guy she was with, and how that's left her in this sort of state of loneliness and in a limbo in her relationship status. So all of that is backstory. That's stuff that occurs before the story really even begins. And it's important for an author to figure all that stuff out, right? To know what you're doing. You can't write a historical fiction story about ancient Rome if you don't know anything about ancient Rome, right? Because you're just guessing and putting in facts that may not be the case. If you're world building in science fiction or in fantasy, and you just sort of don't think about, well, these are the kind of people or aliens or the spaceships or the kind of magic that we would have in this world, right? It's difficult for you to tell a story. But the thing is, you don't have to tell the reader all of your backstory to begin with. Instead, you want to plop the reader right into that magical world, or right into ancient Rome, or right onto that starship that's traveling between the stars, or right at the point where the woman who's seeking romance has moved to a new town, and she's, setting up her new house or her new apartment. You could start right at the beginning of the story and skip the backstory. And you'd be surprised, readers are actually smarter than you think. They'll pick up on the backstory and they'll understand what's going on if you as a writer do a good enough job of inferring it and just weaving us in and popping us in. So I mean, think about like a movie. When you go see Star Wars, I'll take Star Wars for what that's the New Hope, the very first Star Wars with Luke Skywalker that we're all introduced to the series, right? We don't spend the first half hour of the movie explaining the Empire has taken control of the galaxy and there's a rebellion. They do cover that in about 3 sentences, which scroll across the screen so fast you can't even read it, right? And they just plop us right into the story about this ship being attacked by this bigger ship, and all of a sudden these strange guys in white armor come aboard and start shooting and killing these other guys. This plop us right into the action. We'll figure out what's going on. That, oh, this is an empire over here and these are rebels, and okay, I get what's happening. So
I know why I have had to read your book several times. The
yeah.
first, I think you first had it the first 250 words, and now it's
Right.
the first page.
Right.
But I've had to read it twice.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because my very first mistake was I gave too much backstory.
Oh,
And so
yes.
I did the very first time, and I ended up deleting an entire chapter. And so then now I'm going through it again, and I deleted yet another first chapter. And I'm like, all of this is important, but they don't need to know it now. And so
Right.
I've actually deleted my very first 2 chapters, and I do have just a teeny little snippet
Mhm.
of the prophecy that I wanted as backstory.
Yeah.
But
Right.
you talked about last time what info dumping is, and that's kind of what you're
Mhm.
talking about when you're saying giving the backstory. Can you just
Right.
describe what info dumping is for those who don't
Yeah,
know?
so info dumping is a way of sort of giving the backstory to people. So what happens is you might start the story with this action scene, and then you say, and so then the characters are going to walk into the Temple of Doom, we'll call it, and then all of a sudden you spend 2-3 paragraphs telling us about the whole history of the Temple of Doom and what it means and why people are frightened to go there and why nobody's ever walked out of the Temple of Doom who's gone in. So that's info dumping. You're just sort of along the way saying, oh, by the way, here's some exposition for you, just so that way you kind of know what's going on. But that actually really undercuts the suspense, because after we've read those 3 paragraphs, then we finally go back to, well, okay, what's happening in the story? Oh yeah, he's entering the Temple of Doom, but we already know it's scary, so you can't surprise us with all the suspense and tension that could occur in the temple. In fact, usually that's the problem of info dumping or the backstory as a whole, is you take out the sort of all the suspense and tension of a scene by telling us in advance, this is what is suspenseful and tension filled about this part of the story. And you don't want to do that at all in storytelling.
So one of the things that you had mentioned to me previously was that we should try to avoid irrelevant character details. What do you mean by
Mhm.
that? And how do people tend to do that?
Right. Yeah. So what often happens is a writer creates in their head a vision of what a character looks like, for example. That's part of creating a backstory. So, but often the way that the writer creates the character, that vision of what they look like doesn't have to be shared really that much with the reader, because the detail that they're giving is irrelevant. So I might say that somebody walked into the room and they had blonde hair and blue eyes, right? And then it's never mentioned again in the story, because it's really irrelevant what colored eyes that character had, or even what color hair they had. Now, if you were to include a lot of symbolism in your story, this, what they used to do in the past, in the Middle Ages, right? The black-haired woman, the brunette, was always the evil one, and the blonde-haired, blue-eyed was always the wonderful princess, right? So there's a reason why they may have done that in the past, because they're playing upon stereotypes. I mean, we all know people who have red hair and brown or green eyes are obviously superior to blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, right? So, but anyway. So you want to X out all X out red line, whatever you want to call it, blue line, all of those details that really don't tell you anything about the character, because usually they're based on stereotypes to begin with, or two, they're just backstory and exposition. They're sort of the world that the author built, but not all the details that the author built about that world are necessary. Now, you do want to include character details that are really important. So if you have a character who's attracted, say, to another character, you might see this in romance, for example. A woman sees a guy walk into the room and he's got a strand of hair that boyishly sweeps across his forehead, or maybe he has broad shoulders, or he has a boyish grin, something that's very specific and concrete and physically attractive about him. Then you might include that, because then that shows, oh, wait, this female character is attracted to this male character, and that's what she finds attractive. So that's a relevant detail. But including all the other stuff is not necessarily that important in most stories that you do or that you tell.
I always find it very interesting because you don't hear as many blonde haired or
Mhm.
brunette people, but you often will hear about redheads. And I think it's
Right.
because there's a stereotype about redheads. So you
Right.
want, and like actually, my main character in my book is a redhead, but
Ah.
she's a very meek person. But it's supposed to, like, the reason why I said that she had red hair is because I
Mhm.
want to show that she does have a little fire in her. You just don't see
Ah.
it right away. And I think that's
You're
one of
playing
those
off the
things that
stereotype of
and I am a
redheads. Yeah.
redhead, so I feel like I
Yeah.
have the right to do
That's
that.
right.
So I'm not as red as I was when I was younger. It's more like
Mhm.
it's turning more blonde as I get older,
Sure. Sure.
but I have noticed that that is one hair color that a lot of people will put in, and it's usually to show that that person is very fiery
Right.
or whatever. Um,
Exactly.
so another part of the character development that you mentioned that we need to make sure we're showing that telling is also emotional state. Can you give an
Yeah.
example of a bad example and then a good example?
Sure, absolutely. Here, let me grab my notes on that, because again, a good example. In addition to backstory um, and info dumps, the other big place that most people show and don't tell is through their emotional. Because what they'll do is they'll just state a character's emotion. So, for example, um, here's one. We pulled into the parking lot of the Pink Pony. I was a little more than nervous. All right, so you just told us she's nervous, right? Well, that's fine. And maybe that's expedient, but there's a better way to tell us and help immerse us into that. And what you might write instead is something like, we pulled into the parking lot of the Pink Pony. My hand shook as I grabbed the door handle, because now that infers that she's frightened or that she's more than nervous at all, and helps us feel that emotion, because all of us, every one of us at one time in our life, have probably held onto a door handle and been nervous a little bit and our hand shook, or at least we've seen other people do it, or we've seen actors and actresses do it in TV and motion pictures and so on. So we know what that feels like, and then we actually start to feel it ourselves. It's sort of like, if I think, like with news, for example, it's really hard if you just read something like 500 people died, or, well, we'll take the recent bridge collapse in Baltimore, 6 people died, right? And so you're like, yeah, that's tragic and so on. But you feel it more if you actually watch the video itself and see the cars falling off the bridge, and those people are all going to die, that they're going to drown. That hits you harder when you see it. So in many ways, when you're writing the story, you want to get, just as if I were an observer watching that bridge collapse, you want your reader to observe and feel that story as well, rather than just sort of be told it secondhand, like I said, like, oh, this is what happened. It's, you feel a little emotion, but it's not the same punch as if you were right there experiencing it alongside the character of that story.
That's actually one of the things that I'm really working on with this particular edit that I'm going through
Mhm.
my book is when I write like a emotion, I've been
Right,
changing. And because sometimes I build it up, but then I also add the emotion. I'm like, it's kind of
right,
redundant.
right.
And so that's something that I've been noticing that in my personal work as I'm editing the first round of edits anyway.
Yeah.
So is it ever appropriate to tell and not show?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, in that example we gave, we pulled into the parking lot of the Pink Pony. It arguably is exposition. It just states a fact, right? But it's a quick sort of link. So I don't know what happened before in this story, right? Yeah, because I just wrote the example, but presumably they were driving down the road and so on. So for expedience sake, maybe the last scene ended where they decided, hey, let's go out and go do something, or let's go to the Pink Pony. So rather than describe the drive and so on, which is an irrelevant detail, but you need to tell the reader, hey, they've arrived there. So you start the next scene by just saying, hey, we got there. But as soon as you tell that expedient fact, quickly go on and get us right back into showing the story and inferring what's going on. Telling rather than showing does work sometimes. I think a really good example is when you hear like captain's logs. Star Trek does this, for example. What they do is, because they break for commercials, sometimes they got to catch the reader up on what's going on, or for expedience sake, because they only have 50 minutes, right, to do their episode. Rather than going deep into the emotions, the captain might just say, here, this is what's happening and I'm concerned about it, right? And then quickly go right to it. And then you pan onto a vision of Captain Kirk looking concerned, or Captain Picard looking worried and fretting, something like that. So there are times where you might use it, but often people just overuse it all the time, and they don't even think about different ways that they could show rather than tell. And if they did that, though, if they actually went out and showed more and tried to show as much as they possibly could, they really bring their story up a notch. And in many ways, that's what separates a mediocre story from a great story. And sometimes even mediocre stories, plot wise and character wise, just because the craftsmanship is so good, they're sort of elevated up. I know we'll read stories in literature classes, right, or in high school, and go like, well, nothing's happening, right? But the craftsmanship is so good that you can really get into the story and appreciate what's happening.
Do you mind going into dialogue as far as what makes good dialogue, what makes poor dialogue, and how that
Sure.
is, how show not tell applies to that?
Right. Yeah. So that's a whole separate book too. I think I have a chapter in this book though on dialogue as well, but I actually have a whole separate book on writing engaging, natural sounding dialogue.
And that was one of our topics last
Right,
time.
it was. So you have to go back and check that recording, right, and see what
Yep.
happens if you want to learn about dialogue. But specifically with show don't tell with dialogue, usually people who are aspiring writers, novice writers, will go on and tell us what they've already inferred in the dialogue at all. So what often happens is the writer will tell us in the dialogue some fact that could instead be inferred or showed. So a really good example of that would be something like, I'm feeling tired, Alvaro, Susanna said. So Susanna just stated a fact, I'm feeling tired. A much better way to write that would be to say something like, Suzanne yawned, let's go to bed, Alvaro. Now you know through inference or through showing that Suzanne's tired, because one, she yawned, she had a physical action of it, and two, she actually said, oh, let's just go to sleep and forget about it, let's go to bed, right? So that's one way you can look at it. Another thing that often happens in dialogue is sometimes you will tell us or will show in the dialogue something, but then you'll add to it exposition sort of in the tag or the dialogue tag. So you could write something like, let's go to bed, Alvaro, Susanna said, because she was tired. So because she was tired, not only is it kind of repetitive, it's exposition as well. It states a fact. And so those, you can really tighten up your writing by eliminating a lot of exposition that appears in dialogue takes. And you can make your dialogue more interesting and natural sounding too, if you go ahead and show rather than tell.
Speaking of tightening up your writing, how would you tighten up certain descriptions? Because oftentimes vague descriptions can be a little bit boring. How can you
Right.
tighten those up?
Sure. Well, when you're writing descriptively, you want to look at passive versus active voice to begin with. And often boring descriptions, dull descriptions are written in passive voice. And passive voice then tends to be exposition. because you're just stating a fact, right? You're basically any kind of being verb like was, been, has, is, it really equals the active voice verb exist. And exist is a really boring verb, right? So I could say, the chair is over there. It's the same as saying the chair exists over there, right? And that's dull, and that's exposition again, because it's stating a fact. So instead, when you're writing description, you want to come up with something that's relevant about that chair that's over there that you could possibly include in the piece. So perhaps you might describe the way the person sits in the chair and how the chair feels when they sit in it. They sat in the chair and kind of wiggled around a little trying to get comfortable, or she found herself getting growing tired sitting in the chair because it was so comfortable. And so you would then show her maybe yawning, like, oh, I could just I could fall asleep in this chair, saying something like that. And then now you're showing, and then you're describing what that chair is. Now, as you're describing a scene before you, which is often important in historical fiction, science fiction, westerns, fantasy as well, and even I guess in romance and mystery genres, though maybe a little less so. As you're describing a scene, what you want to do is find those relevant details that sort of create an atmospheric mood. So let me quick grab an example of that here, if I could, for you on creating an atmospheric mood in a piece. So this is one way that showing really helps you create mood, because just saying something like, the city was frightening, stating a fact, this exposition doesn't really evoke the mood of fear at all, right? But you can evoke an emotion by showing those atmospheric details. So let's give an example here. So this would be an example of exposition and description. So Captain Aisling was excited that he was given such an important mission of exploration, right? So you instead then would show that and say, Captain Aisling waved his fist into the air and cheered as his gaze turned skyward to Venus. The planet shined bright as a harbor light. So now what you've done is you've weaved in the description of the setting. So the setting is he's out in the desert and he's looking up at the sky, and there's Venus, and Venus is shining bright. So rather than just writing, as Captain Aisling stood in the desert and looked up at the sky, he spotted Venus, and Venus was bright that night. Instead, you include those details and show how they're meaningful to the characters themselves. All right. So let's see if I can come up with another good example of this, because that was a lot of exposition explaining that idea, right? So you might say the street was mysterious. That's exposition, right? Because you're just stating a fact, doesn't evoke much emotion, right? It's mysterious. Oh, what's mysterious about it, right? That's sort of your response. So instead, you could show the mysteriousness and evoke emotion that way, or evoke a mood that way. So you could write, a thick fog shrouded the street, diminishing the lights to mere auras that seemingly hung suspended in the air. Now that's creepy, right? You're walking around, it's foggy, and there's these orbs of light above you, right? In your mind that, oh, that's just the lamppost, right? But what if it's not the lamppost? What if it's something else, right? So inferring or showing with your description, helps take your story farther, because now you're creating, through the evoking of mood and the evoking of feelings and emotion, you're creating suspense and you're creating tension in that piece. And if you do it well, you can even infer something about the character, and you can learn something about the character by their reactions and interactions with the landscape that they're in, the scene that they're in.
Just like sometimes you do need to tell rather than show, what are
Mhm.
times when you should summarize, and when should you avoid summarizing?
Summarizing and when you generally I tell people never to summarize at all. But there are a couple of times you would want to do that. And the primary time is to speed up action between scenes. That would be a really good one. So if you suppose you were writing science fiction and they left from one planet and they're going to the next planet, right? So, and it takes them a week across the void of interstellar space to get there, right? You don't want to have lots of paragraphs describing their whole week. I mean, you might include a paragraph describing how dull it was or something, and then that way it would show how excited they were when they got to their new destination. Oh, finally a planet. We're not out in the middle of this wasteland of space, right? But most cases you would probably just want to skip and get them right to the planet where they're at. So there you might include some exposition, a quick line of it or two, just to show that they've got it. So maybe the last chapter ended with them taking off to the planet Beta Omega, and the beginning of the next chapter might start with something like, after a week they finally had settled into orbit around Beta Omega. So now when you're reading the novel, you're like, okay, a week has passed, we know where they're at. But as soon as you do that exposition, you immediately want to get right into showing rather than telling. I myself would probably say you could even avoid that summarizing, because you could instantly, when you started that new chapter, have it plop them right into whatever trouble they're having as they're orbiting Beta Omega, and then just kind of sneak in through phrases the details that a week has passed and that they're around that planet and so on. So it can take a lot of revising to do sometimes, but there's usually in every manuscript some kind of summarizing that you could take out and show rather than tell.
I think the best advice I got on like
Mhm.
writing a scene is you arrive late and you leave early. And
Yes.
that like helps
Mhm.
me so much when I'm reading, because sometimes I add like this big old like couple paragraphs that don't need to be there. It's like
Right.
that did no value whatsoever. And so
Right.
that's something I remind myself each time I
Yeah.
look at the beginning of my scene. I'm like, arrive early, leave,
Mhm.
or arrive late, leave
Right,
early.
late, yeah, and leave early. That's right. Yeah, dispense with things like goodbyes. This is part of the dialogue, sort of wasted dialogue. When you have greetings and you have goodbyes, a common is like answering the phone, sort of a cliche. The phone rang, and then the guy picks it up. So then he says hello, and you describe all these details, and the other person goes, "Is so and so there?" You could probably skip the hello and just have them, the phone rang, and then go right to the dialogue actually of the other person on the line speaking, saying, "Is so and so there?" And then you're like, "You've called me 3 times this week about it. There is no so and so here. Why do you keep calling me about it?" And so go right into the action as much as quickly as you can. Mhm.
Thank you so much, Rob, for
Oh, you
joining me
bet.
today. I really appreciate it. But I do want to ask the same question that I've asked you
Sure.
twice before.
Okay.
So you probably have been expecting this question. What is one piece of advice that you would give to a not yet published author?
Wow, yes, I got to give a different piece of advice than I did last time, right? Or do I have to make sure I give the same one every time?
You
So,
can give whatever you feel called to give.
yeah, so my a single piece of advice to give would be to study and practice your craft as much as you possibly can. So what I mean by studying is I think it's good to read craftsmanship books, not just because I write them, but because people get, really good authors, guys like Stephen King, for example, or Ray Bradbury. Now, of course, I can't think of anybody, but or even non-writers, people who like the write what is it? Kill the Cat series. I can't think of what it's called now. I'm
Save the cat. I
Save
actually
the
have it in
cat.
my
Thank
book
you.
right
Don't
now.
kill the cat. Save the cat. Yes, but there's a series there, and they're writers, although not as well known maybe as King or Bradbury or some others. But they give great advice. And sometimes the advice conflicts from book to book, and you as an author have to decide what to use. So, study up on your craft, read great stuff, read what's good in your genre. It's okay to occasionally read some trashy bad stuff too. Sometimes after you've read 3 or 4 really good things and then you go back and read trashy stuff, you realize how bad it really was, right? When you were reading it. But then practice. You have to go out and write. You have to absolutely write. You can't become a better writer if you're not a writer. It's like sports. You can, if you want to become a good basketball player, you should go out and watch and see how others have done it, right? How do they shoot the basket? How do they dribble the ball well? How do they make this one move, to get to the basket? And then you actually have to go out and practice it, and you have to imitate it, and then come up with your own moves eventually as you get really good at it. It's the same thing with the writer.
Thank you again, Rob. I really do appreciate it. I also would like to thank my listeners. If you're interested in reading any of his books, which I strongly recommend, you can find them on Kindle Unlimited, and then links will be in the show notes. If you would like to seek his editing services, you can at inventingrealityediting.com. Thank you again, Rob, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for
If
having me.
For those who have really enjoyed hearing him, we have done 2 other episodes, one on engaging dialogue and the other on plot. I also have another really great editor that I have a developmental editor that you could also listen to, Rebecca Hartwell. She is one of the hosts on my monthly book club. Again, Rob, thank you. I
Yeah,
can't
thank
thank you
you.
enough. Thank you for joining us at Authors Alcove, the Writing Corner. We hope today's discussion has inspired and informed your writing journey. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review to help us reach more writers like you. And remember, we are brought to you today by the letter K, as in Knowadays, K-N-O-W, knowadays.com, a company that offers many courses from how to become a freelance writer to how to become a proofreader and editor. Also, I'm always appreciative of any of you who support me on Patreon. You can find the links in the show notes. Also, you can check out me at Authors Alcove, the Healing Place, where authors share about their books on healing and recovery. You can also find me at the Authors Alcove, the Reading Nook, where we talk about reading fantasy, sci-fi, and the occasional horror. Until next time, keep writing, keep creating, and we'll see you back in the Writing Corner.